Before I start, tell me in the comments, have you ever been erased from something that was rightfully yours? I'm Evelyn, and at 59 I thought I knew how family worked. I thought love and loyalty were enough. But on the day my sister read our mother's will, I learned I'd been written out of my own family's history. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I was going to take everything back. Stay with me until the end, because what I did next, no one saw it coming. The air in the lawyer's office was too warm. I sat there with my hands folded, pretending not to notice the way my younger sister Margaret kept glancing at me like I was an uninvited guest. Our mother had passed 2 months earlier. She wasn't perfect, but she was ours, and I had been there for her in her final years, driving her to appointments, cooking her meals, sleeping in a chair beside her bed when the pain was bad. Margaret, she'd been too busy. But now she was here wearing a black designer dress and a perfume so strong it made my head ache. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the will. To my daughter, Margaret, I leave the family estate, the lake house, and all associated assets. My stomach twisted. To my granddaughter, Sophie, I leave. He kept going. Money, property, jewelry, and then, to my daughter, Evelyn, I leave my recipe box and sewing machine as a reminder of the simple comforts you've always loved. I froze. A recipe box. A sewing machine, not the house I grew up in. Not the land I'd worked on for years. Not the savings account I helped her manage. Just scraps. Margaret didn't even try to hide her smirk. She knew you didn't care about money, Evelyn, she said sweetly. You've always been so selfless. I sat there, my nails biting into my palms, my mind spinning. Selfless, no. I'd been stupid. If you were in my position, would you confront your family on the spot tour, walk away quietly and plan later? Tell me what you'd do. I left the office without saying a word. Not because I agreed with it, but because I knew that anger is best served cold. That night, I went through my mother's old paperwork, the ones I had packed myself. When she moved into my house for the last year of her life, bills, letters, receipts, and then I found it. An old binder labeled property and shares. Inside, I discovered something Margaret clearly didn't know. The family estate wasn't just Mom's property. It had been purchased jointly by 3 people, my father, my mother, and me. Years ago, ID put my name on the title when we refinanced the house to save it from foreclosure. I'd signed the papers in my 20s without thinking much of it, but legally, that made me a co-owner, which meant my mother could leave her share to Margaret, but Margaret could never claim the whole thing without my consent. I closed the binder slowly, a new calm settling over me. They thought they'd erased me. They thought I'd fade quietly into the background, but I wasn't just still in the picture. I was holding the frame. The next day, Margaret called. Her voice was syrupy sweet. Evelyn, I'm moving into the estate next week. I'll give you a few days to collect your things. My things? She meant my mother's recipe box and sewing machine. I'll be out of your way, I said. But inside, I was counting steps. I knew better than to march in with lawyers and demands right away. No, Margaret was the type who thrived on drama. If I confronted her too soon, she'd spin the story to make me the villain. So I let her believe she'd won. 2 weeks later, I paid a quiet visit to the county records office. The clerk recognized my name immediately when I handed over the binder with the property title. You still own 1/3 of the estate, she confirmed. That's not something you can just be written out of. I smiled politely, but my mind was racing. That meant Margaret couldn't sell the estate. She couldn't mortgage it. She couldn't even renovate without my signature. And while she might think I'd be a pushover, the truth was, I'd learned how to hold my ground from the woman who'd raised me. I started making small visits to the estate, not to cause trouble, but to remind her I was still there. One afternoon, I walked in with a box of fresh-baked scones for Sophie. Margaret nearly choked on her coffee when she saw me in the kitchen. What are you doing here? She demanded. I pointed to the deed copy I'd brought with me. Just checking on my property, she sputtered, red creeping up her neck. But she couldn't tell me to leave because I had every legal right to be there. The best part, I could see her frustration growing each day. She wanted me gone so badly she was making sloppy mistakes. She skipped utility payments, ignored the gardener's invoices, and I was keeping every single receipt, because this wasn't just about taking back what was mine. It was about making sure Margaret learned that cutting me out came with a cost she couldn't afford. By the 3rd week, my visits weren't occasional anymore. I'd show up in the mornings with coffee, chat with the groundskeeper, and go over repairs that we needed to handle for the estate. Margaret hated it. Every time I walked in, her smile tightened just enough to crack. One afternoon, she cornered me in the hallway. Evelyn, this is my house now, she snapped. No, I said calmly. It's our house. I'm just making sure my share is taken care of. She stormed off, muttering about calling her lawyer. But I knew something she didn't. Lawyers can't erase a co-owner from a title. While Margaret sulked, I got to work. I filed for a maintenance lien on the estate, listing all unpaid expenses she was responsible for since moving in. Electricity, landscaping, even property taxes she'd forgotten about. Every document was stamped, signed, and added to my growing file. I also spoke with the family's longtime gardener, Harold, who confided in me over tea. "She doesn't respect this place," he said. "Hasn't even walked the back gardens once." It was perfect ammunition, not just emotionally, but legally. Neglect of shared property could work in my favor if I decided to push for a buyout. One evening, I sat at the dining table with Sophie, my niece, who was home from university. She was quiet, glancing between me and her mother in the kitchen. "Aunt Evelyn," she whispered, "Grandma always said the estate would be yours one day. She said you knew how to keep it alive." That hit me. Because this wasn't just about Margaret or even me. It was about protecting something our mother had poured her life into. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to settle for just keeping my third. I was going to take back the whole thing, and the first step, making sure Margaret never saw it coming until it was far too late. I invited Margaret to coffee one Saturday morning at the little cafe downtown. She showed up late, sunglasses on, sipping a latte like she was doing me a favor. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone already defensive. I slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside was a neatly organized packet copies of every unpaid bill, every late fee, and the lien paperwork I'd filed. Her face paled. "What is this?" "It's the cost of running our estate," I said evenly. "Since you've chosen not to contribute, I'm protecting my investment." And according to our agreement, I tapped the deed copy. If one co-knower can't fulfill their obligations, the other can initiate a buyout. She blinked, stunned. "You wouldn't?" "Oh, I would," I said, smiling politely. Margaret's pride was her weakness. She couldn't stand the thought of me telling anyone she was behind on payments, so she tried to fight back. She called her lawyer, who confirmed reluctantly that I was within my rights. She tried stalling, ignoring my calls. But I had patience and I had leverage. Every month she failed to pay her share, the debt grew. Every month I documented it, filing updated notices at the county office. It was a slow squeeze, and she didn't even realize how tight the noose was getting. Finally, 3 months in, Margaret called me. Her voice was clipped. "What do you want?" "I want what's mine," I said. "Sell me your share at fair market value, and I'll clear your debts. No court, no public drama." There was a long silence. Then, through gritted teeth, "Fine." We met at the lawyer's office 2 days later. When I signed the final papers, my hands didn't shake. For the first time since that awful day at the will reading, I felt whole. Margaret had walked in thinking she'd erased me, but in the end, I walked out with everything, and yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because taking the estate back was just step 1. Step 2, making sure my family understood that erasing me had consequences they'd never forget. 2 weeks after Margaret signed over her share, I sent out a set of embossed invitations. Each one was hand-delivered, gold lettering on cream cardstock. And at the top, in bold, "You are cordially invited to the Heritage Garden Gala, hosted by Evelyn Hart." I sent one to every relative who had whispered behind my back at the will reading, every cousin who hadn't returned my calls, and, of course, one to Margaret herself. I wanted them to step foot on the grounds they had once tried to take from me, and see exactly who was in charge now. In the days leading up to the gala, I worked with Harold, the gardener, to restore every inch of the estate to its former glory. We cleared the overgrown paths, the fountains ran crystal clear again. Fresh roses bloomed in the courtyard. I hired a local string quartet, a caterer who specialized in family recipes my mother once served, and a photographer to capture every single moment. This wasn't just a party, it was a reclamation. The night arrived warm and fragrant, lanterns glowing along the garden paths. Guests arrived in sleek cars, their eyes widening as they saw the transformation. I stood at the top of the marble steps wearing my mother's sapphire brooch. One by one, people greeted me not with pity, but with respect. When Margaret arrived, she froze. Her eyes swept the grounds, the guests, the music. "This is different," she murmured. I smiled. "It's called care, Margaret, something this place hasn't seen in a while." Halfway through the gala, I tapped my champagne glass. The music faded and all eyes turned toward me. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady. "This estate has been in our family for generations, but recently it faced a danger far worse than time or weather." People shifted uncomfortably. I could see Margaret stiffen in the crowd. "It faced the danger of being neglected," I continued, "of being stripped of its soul." I let the words hang there, then smiled faintly. "But tonight, I want to tell you that will never happen again, because the Hart estate is mine once more, fully, completely." Gasps rippled through the guests. Even a few people clapped, though they glanced nervously at Margaret. I went on, my voice sharper now. I know some of you believed I had no place here anymore, that I could be erased with a stroke of a pen. But this home isn't just brick and mortar. It's memories, it's sacrifices, it's love. And those are things you can't write out of a will. I raised my glass. To the ones who think family is about titles and inheritances, and to those of us who know it's about legacy. After the applause died down, I handed the microphone to the event photographer. She flipped on a projector. Up on the screen came photo after photo, before and after shots of the estate under my care versus its state when Margaret had control. The difference was undeniable. Manicured lawns versus weeds, shining fountains versus stagnant water. I didn't have to say her name. Everyone knew. Margaret slipped out before the night ended, but the rest of the guests stayed late, mingling, laughing, and more importantly, remembering whose hands the estate truly belonged in. 3 days after the gala, a thick envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a formal letter from Margaret's attorney. It claimed I had defamed her publicly and caused emotional distress during the gala. They demanded a written apology and financial compensation. I almost laughed. Margaret wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to scare me, to rattle me into backing off. But she underestimated just how calm I could be when cornered. I took the letter straight to my own lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Whitman. After reading it, Claire smirked. Defamation? That's a stretch. You didn't mention her by name. Then she leaned forward. But Evelyn, if she's willing to pull this stunt, it means she's hiding something. People who feel cornered always are. So we started digging, not just into her finances, but into her recent transactions, her business ties, her so-called friends who'd helped her during the will reading. Within a week, we had a lead, and it was big. Turns out, Margaret had quietly sold off several antique pieces from the estate before the ownership transfer, pieces that were part of our mother's collection, ones the family believed were still inside the house. Claire showed me the auction records, dates, prices, even the buyers' names. It was more than proof of her neglect. It was proof she'd profited from something that wasn't hers to sell. I didn't need to confront her directly. All I had to do was let the right people find out. And once they did, Margaret wouldn't just lose face. She'd lose her allies. I didn't go to the press. Not yet. Instead, I invited a very select group of family members to tea at the estate. Just the ones whose opinions Margaret valued the most. The ones she'd spent years impressing. We sat in the drawing room, sunlight spilling across the polished floors. I poured the tea, laid out the scones, and then I slid the auction records onto the table. This, I said, is what happened to Mother's antiques after I was cut out of the will. At first, no one spoke. They scanned the documents, their brows furrowing. Then Aunt Louise looked up, her face hard. These are verified. I nodded. Every sale, every receipt. She sold them off like yard sale trinkets. The room went cold, because in our family, heritage pieces weren't just things, they were identity. By the end of that week, word had spread. Margaret stopped getting invited to dinners. Her phone calls went unanswered. Even her closest friends began keeping their distance. When she finally confronted me, her voice shook with fury. You think you've won? I met her glare without blinking. No, Margaret. I think I've reminded everyone who really respects this family's legacy. She turned on her heel and left, but I knew this wasn't just about antiques anymore. This was about her pride. And a woman like Margaret would never let her pride stay wounded, which meant the next move was hers. 2 weeks later, I received a glossy invitation in the mail. Margaret was hosting a charity fundraiser at a downtown art gallery in the cause preserving family heritage. It was almost laughable. She was clearly trying to reclaim her reputation and paint herself as the savior of tradition, but I knew better. The antiques she'd sold had bought her a seat at that gallery's board. This wasn't charity. It was a smokescreen. I didn't RSVP. Instead, I made my own arrangements. A private meeting with the gallery's director, I presented the auction receipts, the dates, the proof that the heritage Margaret claimed to protect had been quietly liquidated for personal gain. The director's face fell. That's not the kind of person we want representing us. By the time the fundraiser night came, whispers had already started. Not from me, from inside the gallery itself. I didn't attend the event, but I didn't have to. Friends who were there told me the same story. Margaret had barely made it through her opening speech when board members began excusing themselves, avoiding eye contact. A major sponsor withdrew their donation on the spot. By the end of the evening, Margaret's grand comeback had collapsed before it could even begin. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. Not fully. Because I knew Margaret. And when a cornered enemy has nothing left to lose, that's when they become the most dangerous. It was late afternoon when the knock came. I opened the door to find Emily, my niece, Margaret's daughter, standing there with a suitcase. Her eyes were red from crying. Aunt Evelyn. Mom kicked me out. I brought her inside immediately. Over tea, she explained. They'd fought after Emily defended me at the fundraiser disaster. Margaret had accused her of betraying the family and told her to leave. It was exactly the kind of divide Margaret loved to exploit. Except this time, it was backfiring. As Emily settled into the guest room, I realized something. Margaret hadn't just thrown her out in anger, she'd sent her here on purpose. A planted source. A pair of eyes inside my home. But here's the thing. I didn't turn her away. Instead, I treated Emily like the daughter I never had, because whether she came willingly or not, proximity changes perspective. And if Margaret wanted a spy, she might just end up losing an ally. 1 week later, Emily and I sat in the library after dinner. She hesitated before speaking. "Aunt Evelyn, there's something you should know." She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom's been talking to a lawyer about contesting the ownership transfer. She says she has a way to make it look like you coerced her." My pulse stayed steady. I'd expected as much. But what Emily said next chilled me. "She's planning to use someone from your past to testify against you."